which is part of an ongoing GOOS webinar series exploring issues and projects associated with global sustained ocean observing. My name is Albert Fisher. I'm the director of the GOOS program office based here at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in Paris. And I'll be moderating today. The next hour, we'll start with an approximately 30-minute presentation from Samantha Simmons. Sam is the co-chair, along with Nick Bax, of the GOOS Biology and Ecosystem panel, and she is the assistant scientific program director of the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission. She'll be speaking today about an activity she helped to lead for one of our GOOS regional alliances, the U.S.-based Integrated Ocean Observing System, or IOOS, which was focused on informing priorities for biological ecosystem observations for IOOS. After Sam's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session by chat, and I'll moderate and ask questions verbally. The chat window is already open. You can see it on your screen, and if you'd like to ask clarifying questions during the presentation, please go ahead, or ask questions that could be asked after the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be posted on the GOOS website. So without further ado, Sam, I'll hand it over to you for the presentation.
Just do a quick sound check and make sure everybody can hear me, or you can hear me, Albert.
I hear you loud and clear.
Can you hear me, Albert? Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you to Albert, and also thanks to GOOS for an opportunity to...
Loud and clear.
Okay, maybe a bit of a delay on the line. Okay, so thanks, Albert, and thanks to GOOS for an opportunity to speak with everyone today. As Albert said, I'm the Assistant Scientific Program Director at the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission. I also am the co-chair of the GOOS Biology and Ecosystems panel. And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about a team that I chaired between 2013 and 2015 that was focused on biological and ecosystem observations in the US, specifically focused on US IOOS. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about IOOS for those who aren't familiar. So IOOS is a partnership that's made up of 18 federal agencies and 11 regional partners, academia and industry. And you see on the right-hand side of the schematic there the logos for the 18 federal agencies and representation of the 11 regional associations that are distributed around the US. The IOOS Program Office is a NOAA-led partnership effort that leverages dispersed national investments to deliver ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes data relevant to decision makers. And as Albert mentioned, IOOS is also the US contribution to GOOS. So very briefly to tell you a little bit about, well, first I'd like to acknowledge the people that were engaged in this effort, the task team. There was a lot of work that went into the work I'm going to describe today over 2 years, and these are the folks who were involved. So the task team, as you can see, was composed of 12 people, and we have representatives from 7 of those 18 federal agencies on the task team. We also had a representative of the IOOS Program Office, Hassan Mustafid, and the regional associations were represented by Rafe Kudela, who's active as part of CENCOOS, the Central and Northern California Ocean Observing System. Jay Perlman and Eileen Hoffman actually joined the task team about halfway through our process, and they joined to facilitate connections with the National Science Foundation Research Coordination Network, RCN project that they were leading. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the support that we received from the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. Without the time and effort that Nick and Hannah put into these activities, we wouldn't have made the progress that we did or been as successful as we were. So why biology and why now? Before this effort, IOOS already had 26 core variables, 21 of which are in the table on the right-hand side of this slide that are physical, chemical, or biogeochemical in nature, and the 5 more biological ones that I've pulled out in the text on the left-hand side of the slide. These were identified in about 2002 at a community meeting, and they were mostly physical and chemical oceanographers at the meeting. So for the biological variables, well, I don't think any of us would argue that these are not important for understanding ocean ecosystems. There's not much data that's currently available through IOOS on these variables, and I think most biologists or most ocean ecosystem folks would tell you that there's a need for better representation of the biology and ecology of the oceans amongst these core variables for IOOS. In November of 2012, there was another large community meeting, similar to the one in 2002 that came up with this original listing of 26 variables. And of 25 recommendation areas that came out of that IOOS summit in 2012, 8 of those contained biological elements, so identification of gaps in the observing system or the need for better biological observations, etc. So that's about a third of the recommendation areas contained some element of a need for biology. So the Integrated Ocean Observation Committee, or IOOC, which is the interagency or the group that kind of corrals all those 18 federal agencies as part of the IOOS program, formalized this BIO task team in March of 2013. And the BIO stands for Biological Integration and Observation. So we were the BIO task team. We had an initial 2-year term, and we had 2 main goals. So the 2 goals that you can see here on this slide were to improve the availability of the existing IOOS core biological variables, so those 5 that I mentioned earlier. We also included phytoplankton abundance in this list as well. It seemed odd that it had been omitted. And the second task was to identify and prioritize additional cross-cutting biological and ecosystem observation needs. So today I'm really just going to focus on this second goal and how the team went about that and what our results and recommendations were from that. So to try and accomplish this second goal, the team looked at other efforts. We're not the first group to try and identify and prioritize biological and ecosystem observation needs. So we tried to look elsewhere to see what else had been done for ideas or examples of how to accomplish this. And of course, working within the GOOS world, we can't ignore the framework for ocean observing. So in case you're not familiar with the framework for ocean observing, this evolved following on from the OceanObs 09 meeting, and it allows the characterization of observing systems across disciplines and technologies, and priorities for observing to be established, as well as readiness levels to be identified. So for those of you who don't have a copy of the framework for ocean observing, there's a link to the document on this slide, and you should all check it out. So what guidance did the team get from the FOO, and how did it help our process? The FOO starts with a very simple model of the system, which has an input in the form of requirements, a process in the form of observing networks or observations, and an output in data and products. And these data and products then feed a scientific or societal benefit, which is the source of the requirements. So the key from this slide for us moving forward is this idea of input or requirements. What drives the need for the variables or observations? So essential ocean variables or core variables. This is kind of just stepping back to the bigger picture for the moment. The IOOS program and IOOS Enterprise talks about core variables. GOOS talks about essential ocean variables. And so within this bigger picture context and GOOS's efforts to identify essential ocean variables, arguably this effort could be viewed as a component of that, as IOOS is the US contribution to GOOS. But nonetheless, we're working in this space where we're trying to identify essential variables for climate, weather, ocean, biodiversity, etc. And whether you call it an EOV or a core variable, we cannot measure everything, nor do we need to. Hence, we get down to the essential or the core components of the ecosystem. And these variables must be driven by requirements, but be rooted in reality, and their measurements must be feasible. And so to evaluate this kind of how well are they doing meeting the requirements, or how important are each of the variables towards meeting requirements, and how feasible are they to be measured, what's their level of readiness as far as being considered a mature essential ocean variable or core variable, we have this idea in the FOO of the impact feasibility analysis. And the top right-hand corner there is really where you want to be targeting investments for mature essential ocean variables or core variables. So those that have a large impact and are highly feasible and very ready to measure. However, one important thing to note about the FOO and essential ocean variables is that we may identify a variable that's essential to measure at this point in time. We recognize the need to measure it. It will be highly impactful, but if it's not ready yet, this assessing and encouraging the development of the readiness is also a part of the framework. The framework allows for that to happen so that you can migrate and evolve the variable from bottom left to top right, or top left to top right in this diagram. So going back to the task team activities and remembering that second goal of the task team from a few slides ago, to identify and prioritize additional cross-cutting biological and ecosystem observation needs, how did we get at the requirements? I said, there's the 3 words on this slide in red that are the key components we took from the framework for ocean observing. How did we get at the requirements, and how did we evaluate impact and feasibility of variables? So the first thing that we did was we surveyed the federal agencies for their needs for biological and ecosystem observations. So this was a SurveyMonkey survey that was distributed to all the federal agencies. It was limited to the federal agencies because of Paperwork Reduction Act requirements, etc. But the agencies were asked to consider their legal requirements, mandates, missions, and goals, and answer questions about their needs for biological and ecosystem observations. I'll talk a little bit more about those in detail in just a second. The second activity that the team undertook was to hold an expert workshop. This was held in November of 2014, and at that workshop we took the requirements, the variables that had been identified as being needed to meet the needs of the federal agencies, to an expert workshop where this is a broader community now reaching outside of the federal family, and asking them to evaluate this question of impact and feasibility for all those variables. We have a couple of outputs from all these activities that I'm going to talk about today. First of all, we wrote up a report from the survey analysis, and we also have a report from the workshop. Unfortunately, these reports are still going through clearance, so I can't provide a link to you to be able to access those currently, but I'm hoping that those will be available very, very soon. So what I will tell you about today is the 4 main recommendations that came out from the workshop and this overall effort. So to talk a little bit about the survey first, as I mentioned, it went to the federal agencies. We sent the initial survey request to just over 200 participants across all federal agencies. We had 86 respondents from 14 federal agencies, and that's a response rate of about 40%. So that we thought that was pretty good for the 6-week input period that we requested. So while that's pretty good, we acknowledge that the results are not exhaustively indicative of agency data sets, but the team believes that we have a pretty robust cross-section of agency needs for biological and ecosystem observations represented in the survey results. So I said that in the survey we asked about the needs of the federal agencies for biological and ecosystem observations. Those questions were actually targeted in 4 different areas. So first of all, what needs do you have beyond the existing 5 or 6 core biological variables? What other needs do you have for biological and ecosystem observations that are currently being met by data collected within your agency? What needs are not currently being met, and what needs may not be met in the future? So 3 slightly different dimensional ways of looking at the needs of federal agencies for biological and ecosystem observations. The final question we asked them in this regard was, what do you think the IOOS program and IOOS should consider as the next suite of core biological variables? So across those 4 questions, all the responses were open text field. For any of you who have conducted a survey, you know that that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it allows you to get a breadth and depth of information that you can't get from a drop-down or a more tailored response. However, it also increases the variability in responses you'll get. And so for some of the needs questions, despite the fact that we asked respondents to think beyond the existing core biological variables, for example, one of our responses to the question, what needs do you have that are currently not being met by data collected within your agency. One respondent put fish and nothing else, just the response fish. And the opposite extreme I'll give an example of is a respondent that said they had need for spawning information for a particular fish species in a particular river at a particular time of year. And so we did get a lot of diversity, variability in our responses, and that's what we were looking for. There's a lot of richness in that information then, but how to deal with that was a challenge for the team moving forward. And what we actually did was go through a binning exercise based on the occurrence of some keywords, basically looking at taxonomic groupings, and then looking at the qualifiers for those taxonomic groupings. So whether the respondent was identifying fish or invertebrates or benthic or pelagic systems, and then what was it about the fish that was the variable they were needing? Was it the biomass? Was it fish length? Was it fish age, etc.? So after going through this binning exercise and then considering kind of several tiers of variables that came out of that, we ended up with approximately 60 distinct primary variables, and we took those 60 as input to the workshop participants. So going out to the broader community and asking them to help us evaluate those. Are we missing any? Do you agree with this list of 60? And can we then go through the impact feasibility analysis and prioritize these? So what happened at the workshop? Well, we gave the workshop participants a background very similar to I have given to you today, with a little more detail of how the survey was conducted and what the results were, and here's the diversity in the results, etc. But they were very overwhelmed with that list of 60 primary variables. I think we had closer to 86 or over 100 variables when you got down into some of the finer categories. So that was a bit overwhelming to them, and we talked extensively at the workshop and developed a frame of reference for discussion of all these variables, thinking about what is important in the ecosystem from a biological perspective. And the workshop participants came up with 2 schematics, one of which I'm going to show you today. And I stress, this is definitely a schematic. This is in no way meant to represent a detailed, specific functioning ecosystem, but more it provided the participants at the workshop a way to think about interactions in the environment. And it is basically, a diagram of functional organismal groupings. So if you look at the schematic, inside the blue and green box here, we represent the biosphere, with the grey boxes and arrows outside that representing outside pressures on and interactions with that biosphere. Within the biosphere, the participants at the workshop felt it was very important to acknowledge the importance of benthic and pelagic zones, but as reflected by the colour gradation from blue to green or vice versa, there are no sharp boundaries between these categories when considering the organisms that occur there. The boxes within the biosphere attempt to characterize a minimum number of marine biological components that federal agencies and/or IOOS should monitor to strive to understand the biosphere, the ecosystem. And the arrows provide some examples of interactions that may occur. Again, not exhaustive, but just some examples of interactions that may occur. And I should mention in this representation as well, the microbes refer to non-photosynthetic organisms. So within the box primary producers, you would also have some microbes occurring probably, but the separate bubble here is for non-photosynthetic organisms. So thinking about these functional groupings and going back to that list of 60 plus variables that came out of the survey results, the workshop participants were able to refine that list of variables down to these 36, which were then incorporated in the prioritization exercise for the impact feasibility analysis. So you can see already these are very much more reflective of that type of schematic where you have species in abundance of all those different functional groupings and then some ideas of what's going on within the other components of the ecosystem. How did we do the impact feasibility analysis? Well, first we prioritized each of those variables based on their impact, low, medium, high, or essential. And second, we prioritized each based on feasibility and whether they were concept, pilot, or mature. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in detail now. So for the impact ratings, each variable was scored, for the impact ratings, each variable was scored based on 5 themes, and the first 4 of these were developed at the GOOS biology panel meeting held in Townsville in 2012. So the impact of each variable was evaluated with respect to understanding and monitoring the productivity or the biodiversity or the ecosystem services, etc., of the biosphere. The task team and the workshop participants also felt it was important to evaluate the impact by a 5th category, and that was scientific benefit. So those were the 5 factors, if you will, or themes by which each of the workshop participants scored each of the variables they felt they had the expertise to evaluate by. And again, those rankings were whether it was a low impact, medium impact, high impact, or whether this variable was essential to be able to understand and monitor productivity of the ecosystem, etc. For the feasibility ratings, we used this diagram and the information contained in it, which is taken directly from the framework for ocean observing. Each variable was scored based on its readiness level for these 3 categories across the top of the diagram: their requirements, observations, and data and information, and they were evaluated as being either concept, pilot, or mature. Now there was lots of discussion about both of these scoring exercises, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in relation to the final slide. But in theory, what we get out of that then is this rather busy diagram that ranks each of the 36 variables based on impact and feasibility. So you can see on the y-axis here you have the impact scores, and on the x-axis the feasibility scores. There's a lot going on here, so if you read the legend, as I would, from left to right, top to bottom, you actually move from the top right-hand corner of the plot through to the bottom left-hand corner. So the highest ranked, this is just the sum of both the impact and feasibility scores to generate that legend. So the overall highest ranked variable was fish abundance, followed by primary productivity, fish species, etc. So that gives you a quick way to look at the diagram. And because we had potentially a different number of experts providing scores for each of the variables, depending on whether they felt comfortable that they were expert enough to do that, the scores were averaged and then normalized. We had 5 categories by which to evaluate impact and 3 categories by which to evaluate feasibility. So we've normalized those scores. So this is, 0 to 1 on each axis, you'll see there. This was an interesting exercise as we did it at the workshop. It was done in real time with each of the participants entering scores on a Google Doc that was live projected on the wall in the meeting room. And it was very interesting to watch variables move up the screen or down the screen in real time. But there was a lot of discussion about this because I think the experts felt that they were evaluating impact in an inconsistent manner. So I think there are a lot of lessons we learned that we would change the process we went through if we were to do this prioritization exercise again. There has been some talk of conducting similar exercises within the regions now to look at prioritization within regions here in the US, and I think that there's a lot we learned from this workshop process that we could apply to those prioritization exercises that would improve them. So some of the challenges, for example, are that if you have more fish experts in the room, do fish end up with a better score or a different score than microbes if you only have one microbial person in the room? And if you're missing some areas of expertise, do those variables then not show up at all? So there's definitely some challenges with in-the-room bias, and also some challenges with ensuring, as far as you can, consistency across experts with how they're interpreting the scoring process. So given all those challenges, the workshop participants decided not just to publish this final listing of prioritized variables, but rather to take a step backwards and thinking in terms of that schematic diagram of the ecosystem again, and considering recommendations in these four kind of categories. So the four recommendations that came from the workshop that all the participants agreed was that we must consider interactions, both spatial and temporal, among climate physics, chemistry, and biology. Hence, in the schematic, you saw all the pressures that were important on the biosphere as well. And that the highest priority should be to include species in abundance of other core functional groups, both pelagic and benthic, that are not in the current core variables list. So coral species in abundance, for example, or marine mammal species in abundance. Following species in abundance, biological vital rates are the next priority of biological information to be included as IOOS core variables. And those biological vital rates include things like production, recruitment, mortality, fecundity, growth, and feeding rates. So if you think back to the schematic again, the first recommendation here, including species in abundance, is basically putting one of those boxes on the map, as it were. Are there organisms in this functional grouping? How many of them are there in the biosphere of interest, in the ecosystem of interest? Beyond that, the biological vital rates is getting at a little bit about the dynamics within that box. What's going on with production and recruitment for that particular organism or functional group? The third recommendation was that information on nectar and diet should be included as an IOOS core biological variable. There are several diet data sets for some hyotrophic levels, seabirds, marine mammals, and sea turtles that could relatively easily be incorporated into IOOS. And this third recommendation gets at some of those trophic links or links between functional groupings. If you're considering diet, you're then starting to look at the dynamics within the ecosystem. So those three recommendations are really what came out from the workshop with regard to that schematic I showed, and being able to provide a more complete picture of an ecosystem. We should be paying attention to these three categories of variables, if you will, or core variables. The final recommendation that came out was not necessarily unanimous or a priority for all workshop participants, but the majority agreed that sound should also be included as a core variable. And the rationale there was that sound is a fundamental ocean property which originates from biological, physical, geochemical, and anthropogenic sources and affects many aquatic species. Analogous to ocean color, measurements of sound enable derivation of numerous variables, such as marine mammal and fish presence, wind speed estimates, and ambient noise. And that ambient noise can be anthropogenic or natural in source. So in some ways, sound provides a natural bridge between some of the physical and biological elements of an ecosystem. So it's a little bit more controversial, I think, just because some people don't consider sound a biological variable, and some people consider it purely physical variable, etc. But nonetheless, it was acknowledged as an important variable that should be included for IOOS. So that was really the summary of what the task team got up to over the 2 years it was together. We wrapped things up about July of 2015, and I'd like to just take a few minutes to tell you about some things that have happened since then. So as I mentioned, unfortunately the reports are still being worked on, but I think we're 95% of the way through the clearance process now, knock on wood, and hence I have the word preliminary on this slide just because the reports have not completely been finalized yet. But the IOOC and IOOS has moved forward and has adopted these new core biological variables based on the recommendations here. And so work has been discussed with the regional associations about next steps to be taken and whether or not we can go through some prioritizations exercises regionally. And in particular with sound, there's been some advancement in that there is another interagency task force on ocean noise and marine life that is focused on this question of sound or noise in the marine environment. And so there have some connections are being made between IOOS and this other task force. And the task force is working on a multi-stakeholder, primarily federal agencies at the moment, but hopefully other partners ultimately, to develop a national sound or ocean noise monitoring network and that work will include the development of metadata conventions and processes for archiving raw data. So a lot of work went into the 2 years. My thanks again to the other task team members. We came up with 4 recommendations. Some of those have been adopted and implementation is starting to happen, but it's really exciting to see that from my perspective, that it's not just a report that's going to sit on a shelf, that hopefully some things will come from this as moving forward. So I think I'll leave it there for now and see if anybody has any questions.
Thanks so much, Sam. Really appreciate your talk, and it's actually really nice to see the framework come alive at the national level and be applied so faithfully in a way. I'd open the floor to questions. You're welcome to type questions in the chat window, and I'll ask them as we have time. And to kick things off, I have a few questions of my own, as usual. So you talked about this balance between feasibility and impact in defining what's essential. You want what's defined as essential to be really high impact, high utility, and also feasible. In the impact side, you did a survey of the federal agencies, and it was limited to federal agencies, as you mentioned. It seems like we're missing some audiences, some key audiences of use of biological and ecosystems variables, business community, the scientific community. What do you think are some of the shortcomings in taking this approach, and were you able to overcome some of them, nevertheless, working through the federal agencies?
Yeah, so I think there are obviously audiences we did miss. We were constrained based on Paperwork Reduction Act requirements here in the US. However, I think through the expert workshop, reaching back out to the community and allowing them to look at the variables that kind of sat on top of those needs, that was where we tried to address that shortcoming. And so because we didn't actually ask what the requirements were, we asked what the needs, what variables they needed to measure to meet their needs. We don't have a list of the requirements identified anywhere as part of this process. We asked the federal agency experts, subject matter experts, to take it right to variables, and then at the community workshop, the other community experts were evaluating those in the context of what they know other needs might be, other requirements might be. So that's how we tried to circumvent it as part of the task team. I think the list we came up with is pretty broad and covers most bases, but I'm sure we might still be missing some things. It's baby steps. This is a good first step on the way to identifying all of them, I hope.
And through that survey, did you get at some of the ways the data is actually being used in terms of how it's being transformed, how it's being used in assessments, how it's being used in products that actually help make some decisions?
So that was the first part of the survey, and the first goal of the task team that I didn't talk a lot about today was to increase the availability of information on the existing core biological variables, so those first 5. As part of the survey, we were asking federal agencies to identify if they collected data on those variables over what temporal and spatial scales. Is it in a standardized format? Does it use the IOOS biological data services to make it available? Is it publicly available? And so that was the task team's effort to provide some information to the IOOS enterprise, the program office specifically, to perhaps help facilitate the pickup of those biological data into IOOS. Certainly now that we have expanded the list of core variables, we could revisit that exercise and do something similar for the expanded list. But at least for now, the program office has access to the survey results telling them which agencies are collecting which of those variables, the first 5, and where they're archived, what standards they're using, and if they're already publicly available.
So that's actually one of the questions that's there. Is any of that data publicly available already? Is that survey result going to be released? And the particular question from Flavia is the species distribution data available?
To the best of my knowledge, it's not. Some of it is already publicly available. A lot of our respondents, their data were available through IOOS USA already. The IOOS Program Office, to the best of my knowledge, has not jumped on this component of the BioTask team efforts systematically. They haven't picked up on the survey responses yet. So certainly that's some feedback I could take to them from this activity here, is that there's a desire in the community to have more of those data sets available. And certainly I think some of the regional associations were interested in hearing what the survey results were, to see if there are any federal data sets in their regions that they may be able to absorb into their websites, databases, etc. So I think there's room for a little more work to be done there, but I'm not aware of any activities going on at the moment specifically in that vein.
And you mentioned that one of the preliminary recommendations is to include sound as one of the core variables. So that gets to the types of variables that are about what impact we have on ocean ecosystems. And that can include things that we do measure about ocean climate, for example, about how physical and biogeochemical processes are changing in the ocean. But many of them are also related to direct human impact, whether it's fishing or contaminants, land use practices, direct destruction, touristic use, all these things that are about the way humans use the ocean ecosystem and disturb ocean ecosystems. Does IOOS have a strategy for how to ensure that that kind of complementary data is also collected along with biological and ecosystems data?
Not that I'm aware of at this time, Albert. I think if we can get sound incorporated, that will be an interesting bridge variable from providing information on the biology itself and the physics itself to also providing information on human pressures and starting to look at core variables with that twist, as you suggested. But I don't think that's a focus at the moment. We're still working to get some of this more basic biological information integrated and available.
And then coming back to...
Definitely needed, though.
Okay. And sorry about the delay in sound there. There's quite a bit of a delay here. In terms of the impact, in terms of measuring the impact, the importance of a particular variable, I notice some people take a kind of ecosystem services point of view. They'll try to put some kind of value on the services provided by an ecosystem, different kind of provisioning services, renewing services, even cultural and touristic services. Was there any thought in this process of taking that kind of approach?
Yeah, so if you recall from one of my slides, the impact in this exercise, in the scoring exercise that we went through at the workshop, there were 4 themes that we did score the impact of each variable on. One of those was ecosystem services, and we used the description of that had come out of the GOOS Biology and Ecosystems panel meeting at Townsville. But this was where I think there was a lot of discussion at the workshop in the different ways, even for that one theme, and given the description that was provided, there were still workshop participants that were interpreting that in slightly different ways, and as a result providing different scores. So there was an inconsistency across those 5 themes for the impacts of how people were scoring the variables. If we did this again, that is where I think one of the places we would spend a little more time focusing in on this, and perhaps going through a Delphi process whereby everybody scores it initially, and then we discuss the scores and we discuss people's interpretation of them, and perhaps revise the definition or the description of what ecosystem services is, just for that effort to bring a little more consistency to the scoring process. So I think it's an important category, and we used what had been done before, but I think we can improve it if we do this again.
So I'm aware of some examples, such as in NOAA fisheries, of taking an ecosystems-based approach to fisheries management. But is there any of the agencies that you were aware of in the US that does take that kind of ecosystem services approach and tries to put some either economic or other type of value on the ecosystem services?
I think it's becoming more of a priority and more prevalent in what many agencies are doing, and particularly in what NOAA's been discussing recently. So I think we will see it coming in more and more, absolutely. The IOOS Program Office just finished collaboration on an ocean enterprise study looking at the ocean enterprise as a whole. And so I think that's an indication, again, of the increasing importance of this thematic area.
Okay. Now, so you've defined these variables, or you've taken a step towards defining these variables. You mentioned that one next step in the process might be to look at that in a more refined way from the regional perspective around IOOS, the different regions. But defining variables is one step in improving the biological and ecological aspects of IOOS as a whole. So what do you think the next steps are for IOOS once this definition phase is over?
Implementation and actually being able to serve up data. And I know that's one of the greatest concerns of the regional associations is, okay, great, you're telling us to measure more things, but where's the money to help us be able to do that? And so I think that's a challenge that we have to try and tackle in collaboration with the regional associations, and also in collaboration with understanding a little bit more about the ecosystem services and where there may be other potential sources of funding for collecting information on any of these variables.
And how much of the requirements put on by the agencies is in regulation? And how much of it is really just sort of from a broader understanding of the scientific value and the need for the observations? Do you have a sense of that from the survey?
I don't think we can really get a sense of that from the survey. We asked them what the needs were to meet their mission and mandate. To use an example of the Marine Mammal Commission, we're obviously focused on marine mammals and their conservation and preservation, but our mandate actually requires us to maintain marine mammals as functioning elements of their ecosystem. And so that gives a breadth to our mandate that gives us some flexibility in how we interpret it and where we work. But obviously, to maintain them as functioning elements of the ecosystem, one could argue you need to understand the ecosystem as a whole, and therefore anything is fair game. So I think there may be an element of that in some of the agency responses, but we don't have a way of getting a handle on that from the specific responses to the questions we had in the survey.
Okay. And let me again encourage everyone in the audience to please ask their questions. So it's not just a conversation between me and Sam. So just to respond to the question from Nimit, yes, the recording will be available on the GOOS website within a few days, and you'll be able to see the entire webinar that way. So we have a question from Brian Melzian from EPA, the US EPA. So it's kind of an example, actually. The US EPA uses benthic data, species abundance, species in abundance, and sediment chemistry in monitoring programs and surveys determine the status, trends, and health of estuarine and coastal environments. So these data are used to publish national coastal condition reports, a type of assessment that are posted on the EPA's national website. So I guess that's one of the agencies that surely was part of your survey and was able to express their needs through this assessment process that they do. Moving to,
Yeah,
when we looked at this,
absolutely.
I don't know if you wanted to, do you want to respond to that or say anything further about that, Sam?
No, I'm good for now. Thanks, Albert.
Okay. So if we talked about the essential side, we talked a lot about the impact, the importance of a particular variable. Also, you looked at the feasibility. That seems to be, for me, an area where in biological and ecosystems variables, there's a lot of movement. It's developing very quickly. For example, there's a lot of technological development related to genomics and other omics measurements that are more and more ready to deploy on different types of ocean observing platforms. Uh, so let me just ask a question about those types of technologies in particular. What type of time frame do you see those becoming sort of routine enough that the feasibility aspect really moves into the target zone?
Yeah, and I think that's going to vary by variable, obviously, its potential impact and who's interested in supporting its development. So we didn't have a lot of time to focus on that in detail at the workshop. The evaluation of feasibility that are contained in these analyses I've described today are based purely on subject matter expert opinion. So each of the variables we didn't necessarily get down into, okay, what are all the sensors and the techniques and methods that are out there for measuring this, and what is their level of readiness. It was more of a holistic subject matter expert opinion on where the maturity of the observing system was for each variable. So there was actually a spin-off effort from the BioTask team that was co-led by Francisco Chavez, Jay Perlman, and myself, with Francisco doing most of the driving, that was trying to get a more in-depth look at these sensors for biological variables. What is their level of readiness? Where are the potential commonalities or platforms? So, for example, for a lot of the apex predators we talked about, seabirds and marine mammals and sea turtles, perhaps the platform for observing their species occurrence, distribution, and abundance would be in common. So you might be able to collect information on all three of those core variables using one platform. So we are in the process of writing up a report from that. I presented a poster on that at the Ocean Sciences meeting in New Orleans in February that I'm happy to share with folks if they're interested. But basically, that is an area that we need to spend a little more time focusing on for each of these variables. What specifically are the methods and techniques? How well established are they? How long have they been used? What's the maturity of them? And will they be continued into the future?
You mentioned that the next step is implementation in a sense, but there's questions from the regional associations about how to finance it, how to put that into place. How closely linked is that implementation then to the rest of the chain of delivery of information? So that means the data management systems, but then also models or assessment processes or synthesis processes that actually transform that raw scientific data into something that an agency values for use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think very closely linked, and I think one of the main ways that the IOOS Program Office has been able to try and help facilitate that connection, those connections, is through their data management and communication protocols, the development of data standards that will allow the information to be collected or shared via common web services. And that's something that has been done for biological data, for a few example biological data sets to date, and certainly one thing that we would be looking to do with the regional associations moving forward if they are interested in picking up any of these new variables, so that when another region is looking to integrate the variable, there's a common set of data standards and web services for them to be able to make the data available.
What are the kind of coordination processes that IOOS has in place to encourage that sharing of standards or best practice across the different regions?
I think it varies for different categories of variables, and there are probably some people on this webinar that can answer this much better than I can. But a few examples that come to mind, for example, with the biological data sets is some training webinars that have been done, as well as some one-on-one training times or case studies done with different data sets to work through the process of integrating them to establish the data standards and services based on that, and then to provide training webinars to the rest of the IOOS enterprise to try and share that information and promote its future use on other data sets.
Do you know if those training webinars are available outside of the US? Or are they available to a broad audience for people who are interested?
I can find out for you and get back to you. I'm not sure if Philip's still on this webinar or not. Philip Goldstein was on earlier. I don't know, Philip, if you can type a response in the chat, or Jan Newton, but I think the webinars were recorded and the recordings are available through IOOS. I'm just not sure exactly where, so I can certainly investigate that and try and provide that information. Oh, Hassan's on the line as well. Hassan probably could answer that as well.
So Nimin has quite an interesting question, which is maybe less relevant in the national context, but is certainly relevant in the international context in which we work, which is about the recognition of sound as an important parameter. How do you convince security agencies to permit the collection of such data, especially within an exclusive economic zone?
It's a very good question. Within the US, the Navy and Department of Defense have worked extensively with all entities, including academic, so federal, industry, academic entities, collecting sound information and providing procedures for scrubbing of the data before it's made publicly available. So it's not ideal. It's taken some discussions and deliberations to allow or to get academics comfortable with giving up their data sets to be scrubbed, but that allows the removal of any sensitive information, as it were, from the data set before it's made publicly available.
And other sensitivities with other of the variables that you think in terms of releasing publicly the data publicly from the IOOS perspective, from the US perspective?
Sensitivity to the other variables, certainly with regard to species occurrence and distribution for protected species, and if you're using live telemetry data streams, there's some concern there, but I don't think it's anything that's insurmountable that we can't get around. To provide at least some summary information available to the public, or at least let them know that the activity is going on to collect these data.
And so we have a comment from Phil Goldstein, just in reply to the question I had before, that he's developing the webinars to enroll biological data into OBIS and IOOS. They're not recorded yet, so we'll look forward to those when they're available. And Hassan wanted to ask a question about the webinar. Anybody is free to please ask questions in the chat window, and I'll try to answer them as we can. Just to come back to some of the preliminary recommendations out of this process. You said that you gave priority to species in abundance and then biological vital rates. What was the reasoning behind that prioritization to first look at the species in abundance above the biological vital rates? Some modelers might be more interested in the vital rates than they are in the actual species in abundance.
They might be, and I think it was just across all of those functional organismal groupings, knowing what's there and how many or how much of them is in simple terms the key thing to know initially. For some of the smaller organisms, the plankton, you can't always get species, and so looking at activity for microbes or productivity for some of the smaller phyto and zooplankton might be equivalent, but looking across the whole gamut, some idea of what's there and how many or how much of them seem to be the most basic information that the majority of the workshop participants were comfortable including as the first recommendation, the highest priority.
Was there any discussion in the process about the data policies and also the data management systems that are necessary to make this available in a very easy way for researchers and for the agencies that are involved?
Sorry, can you repeat that question, Albert? I was reading Abby's question on the screen. I'll stop it.
That's great. No, I was just wondering if in the process of this coming together with the EOVs, whether you had some serious discussion about the data management requirements and the data dissemination requirements to make this information widely available for the agencies and for the scientific community.
As part of the task team process, we did not. We had that list of the 4 recommendations and the results of the survey, and basically turned that back over to the IOOC and the IOOS program office. And some of the task team members, myself included, are trying to stay engaged with this process to make sure there is some follow-up and see that something happens from that. And this would be one of the areas that I think we would want to push, but it didn't happen as part of the task team activities.
So let me thank Hassan for putting up the web links to a huge number of these previous webinars and examples of IOOS regional implementation. And let me ask Abby's question about whether the group had considered grouping those variables trophically or by traits rather than taxonomically, as you've done. There's many different ways to sort of step back from the detail of biological activity and try to group things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned one schematic that I showed and another schematic that I didn't show. The first schematic is functional organismal groupings, which is effectively trophically. We had a little trouble when it came to discussing the question of trophics when you're talking about dynamic open ocean food webs. But rather the functional organismal groupings. The other schematic and way of thinking of things that the workshop participants came up with that I didn't present today that will be in the workshop report is by considering flow of energy through the ecosystem. So that is arguably trait or more trophically based. But so yes, we had those 2 ways of thinking about it. And as you said, Albert, there's a number of ways you could break it down. In the 2.5-day workshop we had, those were the two that we had the opportunity to develop to a level of maturity that people were comfortable discussing and including in the workshop report.
So let me turn just for a few minutes to the group that you're co-chairing now for GOOS, the Biology and Ecosystems panel. There's, not surprisingly, a lot of parallels in what you've done for the US with the process that the group is going now through for a global community and the global context. What do you think you've learned from the US process to apply to the global context, and what are the major differences in the way the approach that's being taken by the Biology and Ecosystems panel now?
It's a good question. What did we learn? We learned we need to be careful of in-the-room bias. So I think that's something Nick, Patricia Ward, and I are being very conscious of in all our discussions for the GOOS Biology and Ecosystems panel. I think we have taken a slightly different tact with that effort from previous efforts that GOOS has taken, and I guess it's driven, well, there are parallels with what we did in the US in that in this case we've conducted a survey of ocean observing initiatives to try and establish who's measuring which variables on which temporal and spatial scale, and that will actually feed into the feasibility side of the impact feasibility analysis for the GOOS Biology and Ecosystems panel. And to get at the requirements rather than a survey, we've done a review of all the drivers and pressures as listed in international organizations, mandates, and bodies that are required that are requirements at that kind of broad international level. So there are parallels, there are similar activities. We may have applied them in slightly different ways, but both through Nick's participation in the 2012 Townsville meeting and my engagement with this US activity, this challenge of ask 80 different biologists what the core variables or essential ocean variables should be, and you'll probably get more than 80 answers, is something that we're still wrangling with, and I think it will remain a challenge, an ongoing challenge, because when you present a list of variables to any biologist, I think the first thing they do is look to see where their particular pet variable appears, and if it doesn't, I think they're resistant to hearing about the process you use to establish the list, because obviously it can't be right or correct because it didn't incorporate what they feel is the most important variable or what they've spent a long time studying, etc. So I think we're aware of those challenges, and we're aware that this is going to be an iterative process. We can come up with a draft list based on activities of the panel and the steering committee, and then we'll have to go back to the community and we'll have to be prepared to reevaluate the list and incorporate different variables, new variables, etc. But I think again, it's a slow progress. It's baby steps, taking baby steps forward and identifying that initial list to put out there and give people an opportunity to comment on, and then we refine it from there.
Do you think there's anything fundamentally different about the drivers of biological and ecosystems observations in a global context versus US context, or about the feasibility of doing observations in a more global sense in really across the world with scientists of very, very different capacities? Do you think you'll come up with just a different, quite a fundamentally different set of answers in the global context and in the US context?
I don't think it will be fundamentally different. I think it will be refined in different ways across different taxonomic or trophic groupings or trait groupings. Fundamentally, in both cases, we're trying to look at what's important to measure in the ecosystem. That will change regionally, but I don't think it changes fundamentally, if that makes sense. The ecosystem is the ecosystem, and what you need to understand about it is the same overall, even if the details differ in region. So I'd probably elaborate on that, but I see we're running out of time. But certainly, as far as the feasibility question of being able to achieve mature status, readiness status for variables in the US versus globally, there will definitely be greater challenges there in the global context, I think, and it will be up to the panel potentially to come up with some innovative ways to try and address that. And we're looking at different mechanisms for trying to evolve from pilot concept through mature for each of the variables. I don't think one size will fit all. I don't think one mechanism for corals will work for phytoplankton or zooplankton, for example. So we're going to have to be pretty flexible, I think, in our approaches.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. We are, in fact, out of time, so let me thank you again for your webinar. It was very interesting, and I'm looking very much forward to the work that you're helping to lead with the GOOS Biology and Ecosystems panel. Thank you also to the audience for joining us, for being active and providing us lots of examples of the webinars that are available. And I'd encourage you to go to the GOOS website. It's ioc-goos.org. You can look at previous webinars, and soon you'll be able to see a recording of this webinar. And you can sign up for our mailing list under the GOOS updates to get newsletters as well as announcements of these webinars and other important news about global ocean observing. So thank you again, Sam.
Thanks, Albert. Thanks, everyone.